In this video, we will be overviewing our unit on biochemistry. And first of all, we'll take a look at what a biochemical molecule is, which they are molecules that are found in living things. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are all examples of biochemical molecules, and we'll spend time throughout the unit looking at each of those molecules individually. Now, until a few hundred years ago, scientists used to believe that organic molecules could only be made by a vital force. So they could not be made in a laboratory setting. A vital force had to act upon it. And this theory was considered vitalism. But in the 1720s, urea was able to be produced in a laboratory setting, and urea is a biological molecule, so that totally threw that theory out the window. So vitalism is not considered a thing anymore. And an organic molecule is a molecule that contains both carbon and hydrogen. And the examples that I've placed down below here in this slide is methane is an example of an organic molecule. Pretty much all biochemical molecules are organic, so carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are all also organic because they contain hydrogen and carbon along with other atoms. An example here to the right is carbon dioxide. It's not an organic molecule because it contains carbon, yes, but it doesn't contain hydrogen. Another example would be water is not an organic molecule because it contains hydrogen but not carbon. Now, for those of us who haven't studied chemistry in a while, or for those of us who have and need a little bit of a refresher, I thought it would be a good idea to go over the structure of ionic bonds versus covalent bonds, because that type of bonding is important to distinguish when we talk about biochemical molecules. So first of all, an ionic bond is formed between a metal and a nonmetal, and it involves the transfer of electrons. So in the example here, sodium is giving up an electron because it only has one in its valence ring to chlorine, who really would like to fill its valence ring. So it's going to take that extra electron to fill it up, and then we're going to have a positively charged sodium ion and a negatively charged chlorine ion, and those two ions will be attracted to each other, and that attraction is an ionic bond. Now, a covalent bond, it occurs between two nonmetals, and in this case, electrons are shared between the two atoms. And if you look here, we have two hydrogen atoms here, and they're sharing their electrons. So each of them has one valence electron, and if you remember, hydrogen only has one valence shell, so the first shell only holds 2 electrons. So each of them is looking for just one more electron to fill its ring. So they're going to come in close proximity to each other and then share their electrons with one another, and that forms a covalent bond. So we're going to take a look at carbon right now. Carbon is very important in terms of organic compounds because it forms the backbone of all biochemical molecules. And carbon is special because it has a binding capacity of 4, meaning that it has 4 electrons in its valence shell. So it needs to gain 4, so share 4, or give up 4 to an ionic compound, which is quite rare. So in this case, it forms covalent bonds because it's wanting to share electrons with other atoms. And carbon's special because it can have a single, a double, or a triple bond. And the examples that we have here, the first one, we have all single bonds between the carbons, and this is ethane. So 2 carbons and then a single bond, so the rest of the spaces are filled up with hydrogen atoms. Ethene, which is this one here, there's a double bond between the carbon atoms, so now it can't bind with as many hydrogen atoms. So this molecule is C2H4. This one was C2H6. And then our third one is ethyne, and in this case, carbon shares 3 electron pairs with each other, and we have a triple bond, and that only allows them then to bind with 1 hydrogen atom each. So ethyne is C2H2. Now, carbon can also form long chains of carbon atoms, and it can be found in branched or ring form. So in this case right here, this is a fatty acid, and we'll learn more about fatty acids when we talk about lipids. And you can see that it's a long chain. It can be even longer than this. And then over here, we have a ring structure, so the carbons are forming a ring. That would be, in this example, glucose, which we'll learn when we learn about carbohydrates. Now, a functional group is a group of atoms that is bonded to the carbon skeleton that help give the molecule certain properties. So depending on the functional group, it could make the molecule soluble in water, or it could make it insoluble in water. It also helps us identify the type of organic molecule. So we look for functional groups, and then we classify the molecule based on the functional group. So some examples here: if we had a hydroxyl or an OH bonded to the carbon molecule, then that would be an alcohol. So hydroxyl is an OH. Carbon with a double bonded O is a carbonyl group. And in this case, this could mean that the molecule might be an aldehyde or a ketone, which if you study grade 12 chemistry, you'll understand that. And then over here, there's a double bonded O and an OH, and that's a carboxyl group. And that's just an entirely different type of molecule. So fatty acids are special carboxylic acids, so they have the carboxyl group. A nonpolar molecule is a molecule where the atoms and the electrons are arranged symmetrically in the molecule, and it makes the molecule insoluble in water. And the examples that I have here, this one here is methane. So we have a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms bonded around it. It's completely symmetrical. There's no imbalance in arrangement of atoms around the carbon. The next example here is oxygen. So again, we have 2 oxygen atoms on either end, so they're exactly the same. And then we also have some lone pairs of electrons, but they're evenly spaced around the molecule. So this one also is symmetrically arranged. And then our third example would be carbon dioxide. Same thing, we have a carbon in the middle, and on either side is an oxygen atom, so it's symmetrically arranged as well. So that makes it nonpolar. Polar molecules, on the other hand, have an asymmetrical arrangement of atoms. So because of that, there's an unequal sharing of electrons or of electron pairs, or there's lone electron pairs, and the molecule will end up with a partially positive end and a partially negative end. And these are called dipoles. And polar molecules are soluble in water because of this unequal arrangement. So if we look here, we have water, so H2O. And if you take a look, oxygen has lone pairs of electrons on one side, and it also has a stronger affinity for the electrons that it's sharing with hydrogen too. So it pulls the electrons towards itself, like so, and that's what those arrows are demonstrating. And that makes oxygen slightly negatively charged. So this symbol here means that's a negative dipole. And then down here, the hydrogens, because the electrons are being pulled away from itself, has a positive dipole. And that's how we represent it. And then over here, hydrogen chloride, same thing. Chlorine has a stronger affinity for electrons than hydrogen. So even though it's sharing, it's not sharing very equally. So it's hogging the electron in the shared pair. And that gives hydrogen a positive dipole and chlorine a negative dipole. So because of that, they can interact in water with those dipoles. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about water. Intramolecular forces are forces of electrostatic attraction within a molecule. And these forces of attraction hold the molecule together. And it's actually the bond itself that's in the molecule holding it together. That's what intramolecular forces are. And these forces have to be broken by chemical means. So when a chemical reaction happens, those bonds are broken, atoms are rearranged, and we form new compounds and new molecules. So the example that I'm showing here, hydrogen chloride again. So we have our hydrogen atom and our chlorine atom, and they're sharing a pair of electrons. And that would be the intramolecular force. It's the covalent bond that's between the two atoms. Now, in an ionic compound, it would be the same thing. The intramolecular force would be the attraction between the two in the ionic bond. Intermolecular forces are forces of electrostatic attraction between molecules. So if we take a step backwards and we look at the breakdown of the word, inter means between, and intra, the example we talked about before, means within. So anytime you see inter, it's something between, and intra is within. Intermolecular forces are much weaker than intramolecular forces, and they can be affected by physical changes. So a temperature change may cause the forces to weaken or strengthen depending on whether the molecules are getting closer to one another or farther apart. So in this example, again, I'm using hydrogen chloride. If we had two of those molecules hanging out together, the positive dipole of hydrogen would become slightly attracted to the negative dipole of an adjacent chlorine atom, and what we end up with is a force of attraction called the intermolecular force. And we're going to learn about the different types of intermolecular forces in the next few minutes. And we will start with the weakest one. So the first of the three intermolecular forces is London dispersion forces. And in this example, the electrons of one molecule become attracted to the nuclei of neighboring molecules. So if you take a step back to the structure of the atom, remember the nucleus has protons and neutrons within it. And protons are positively charged, and electrons are negatively charged. So the electrons are going to be attracted to the positively charged nucleus. And London dispersion forces are the only forces used to hold nonpolar molecules together. And these are also sometimes called van der Waals forces. Now, if you look at this diagram down here, we have two helium atoms really close to one another. And you can see that there's actually some repulsive forces and some attractive forces at play. So it's like London forces, there's some attraction, but it's kept at an arm's length. So if you take a look, these are electrons. They're negatively charged, and we know that like charges repel. So the electrons in the two electron clouds would repel each other. However, they'll also be attracted to the nucleus of the adjacent atom. So there is some repelling, but there's also some attraction going on at the same time. Our next type of force are dipole-dipole forces, and these forces are stronger than London forces, and they occur between polar molecules. And in this case, negative dipoles are attracted to positive dipoles. So again, we're looking at our hydrogen chloride molecule right here, and we've got a positive dipole on hydrogen. It's going to become attracted to a negative dipole of a chloride ion in a neighboring molecule. And then same thing over here, this dipole is being attracted to that dipole, and it would go on and on and on throughout the solution. Our final type of intermolecular force, and the strongest one, is hydrogen bonding. And this is a type of dipole-dipole interaction that's between a hydrogen atom in one molecule and either fluorine, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, or phosphorus in another molecule. And like I said, it's the strongest of the intermolecular forces. So in this example, we can see water exhibiting this hydrogen bonding. So this negative dipole on oxygen is attracted to a hydrogen, and this hydrogen is being attracted to another oxygen, and so on and so on. So this hydrogen bonding actually gives water some very unique properties, which we'll talk about later in this video. So hydrophilic molecules, if we break down that word, hydro means water, phile or philic means lover of. So if you are hydrophile, you love water. So water-loving molecules. And hydrophilic molecules dissolve in water, or they interact with water. And hydrophilic molecules would include polar molecules and ionic compounds. So in this example here, we have water, which is represented by the red and white molecules. And then we have a salt compound. So we have a crystal of salt here, sodium chloride, and over time, the chloride atoms are going, or chloride ions are going to interact with the positive dipoles of water, and the sodium ions are going to interact with the negative dipoles of water, so with the oxygen end of the molecule. And this would just happen over and over again. And that would be a hydrophilic molecule. So ionic compounds and polar molecules are hydrophilic. Now, hydrophobic molecules are considered water-fearing molecules, so hydro, water, phobia, a fear of. So these molecules are repelled by water and or other polar molecules as well. And they will be attracted to other non-polar molecules. So lots of non-polar molecules can interact with each other, but they cannot interact with water. And you can see that in this example. So oil and water, doesn't mix well together. They just form globules or droplets and then rise to the surface if you try to mix water and oil. And then here's another example where we have a leaf with a bead of water on top, because the leaf has a waxy cuticle, and wax is hydrophobic as well, so the water can't dissolve onto the leaf surface. So for the next few minutes, we'll talk about water. And water is an amazing molecule. It has so many unique properties because of its dipole nature. It's so important for life. If you think about us, we're mostly water. Most of the Earth's surface is covered with water. Most reactions occur within solution, dissolved in water. And due to the fact that water is polar, it allows for so many essential biological interactions. And we'll be talking about those properties over the next few minutes. So the first property of water is that water molecules stick to one another in a process or a phenomenon known as cohesion. So cohesive means that you work together well, you stick together. So water molecules stick to one another, and that's cohesion. And this cohesion leads to increased surface tension. And I've kind of demonstrated that here. So the hydrogen bonding between water molecules creates that surface tension, and it's hard to break the surface of water. And if you've ever accidentally done a belly flop, you know how hard water can feel when you can't break the surface tension easily. And some bugs can actually walk on water due to this property. So they can distribute their weight in such a way that they are not breaking that surface tension. And instead, they bend the water, but they don't actually go under the water. Now, adhesion is the property that water molecules can stick to other polar molecules. So this allows for a property or phenomenon called capillary action. So I have here in this diagram a straw, a glass tube inside a beaker of water. And if you've ever noticed this with a regular straw too, if you look at the level of the liquid in the straw, it'll be a little bit higher than the surface of the water in the container. So this is because of capillary action. So the water molecules are being attracted to and pulled up the straw or the glass tube. Now, this phenomenon, along with cohesion, is what allows plants to be able to take water in and transport it through the xylem. So if you remember about transport in plants from grade 11 biology, water molecules are drawn in through the roots from the soil, and then through climbing the xylem, so being attracted to the walls of the xylem and also being held together by each water molecule, the water pulls up the xylem to the leaf where the pressure has decreased through evaporation. So that is adhesion. Water is considered the universal solvent because more substances can dissolve in water than any other liquid. Ionic compounds can dissociate into ions and mix and mingle within the solution. Polar molecules can dissolve and nonpolar molecules can, and that's because nonpolar molecules are hydrophobic. Because of this property, water is a great mode of transport in the body because our blood plasma is mostly water. So blood is almost 50% water. And that means that we can transport dissolved ions, we can transport dissolved oxygen, hormones, everything gets transported through the blood. Now the problem with water being a universal solvent is people used to think, and still do think, that the solution to pollution is dilution. If you have something you don't want anymore, just pour it down the drain and it'll dissolve and spread out, and it won't, practically won't even, harm the lake or the river that you're depositing it in. But cumulatively, that would be a huge problem, and we have damaged many ecosystems because of this principle. Not a very good principle to live by. Water also has a very high heat capacity, and what that means is that it can absorb a lot of heat before the temperature of water changes. So it can absorb a lot of heat before the temperature rises by 1 degree, and it also has to lose a lot of heat before the temperature decreases by 1 degree. And this is due to water's hydrogen bonding. And it's a really great thing because it prevents lakes from freezing over the winter, and it keeps our lakes and rivers pretty much a relative consistent temperature. If it got really hot and water could change at the same rate as our air temperature, fish and wildlife would be freezing and overheating all of the time, whereas lakes and rivers pretty much stay relatively the same. Their temperature changes are very gradual. And also, it allows us to cool ourselves through sweating. So when we sweat, we bring water to the surface, and then that water will evaporate. And when the water evaporates, it carries some of the heat away, and then we feel cooler. So that is the principle of water having a high heat capacity. Water is also transparent, which lets light travel through it. And that's really important because it allows plants to live underwater, so light can penetrate through the lake, and then plants can still photosynthesize. It also allows us to be able to see through the layer of water that covers our eye. That would be a problem if we couldn't see. Ice also floats because ice has a very open structure, and that allows it to become less dense than water, so it floats on top of the water. And this is really important because it allows for wildlife survival over the winter time. So what happens is the lake doesn't freeze from the bottom up and then become one solid mass of ice. Instead, the water freezes at the top, and the whole lake doesn't completely freeze solid. There's still water below the surface, and that allows for plants and organisms to live under that surface. It also is very helpful when it becomes springtime because the ice is at the surface of the lake, and the sun's rays will penetrate it and help melt it, and when it becomes warmer in the daytime. The final property of water that we'll talk about today is water is amphiprotic. So what that means is water can act as an acid or a base depending on its environment. So if an acid is added to water, then water will act as a base to help buffer or neutralize that acid that's being added. And if a base is added to water, then water will act as an acid to help buffer that addition of base. So it prevents water from having huge fluctuations of pH when an acid or a base is added to it. And that is a relatively brief overview of our biochemistry introduction. Over the next few days and weeks, we'll be looking into depth at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, enzymes, and so on. And we'll become experts at this stuff.